G'day everyone, happy Friday the 11th of January 2019. We're back with another coding challenge on the Exercism elixir track. Let's jump over, take a look and solve the problem. I've got grade school up here, that's today's problem, and I've loaded it up into VS Code. We're going to jump in and solve it up. I've loaded up the school module here so we can take a look at what we need to implement, and today we need to make a little module that builds a little school database. If we take a look at the test file, we can see what it's actually doing. We have our school database here, which is an empty map that we have, and we'd like to add to this map names and grades. So if we take a look at our implementation for the first function that we need to do, which is add, it's going to pass in the database, which is a map. It expects a name of the student, which is a string, and then a grade, which is an integer. And what we expect to get out is a map. If I jump back over the test, we can see here that this is what we want. If we call school.add with an empty list, pass in Amy as the name and 2 as the grade, then what we expect to get out is a map with just that. I'm going to paste that in the comments just so I have a reference of what we need to implement. And let's go through and implement that first. So we're passing in an empty and we need to return this out. Probably if you're new to Elixir, the easiest way to do something like this would be do something like getting the current value, updating it, and then returning the value again. So let's imagine if we were to call this again and we wanted to pass in Percy into grade 2. What we expect to happen is that we have Amy, and then we also have Percy in there. How would we do something like that? In Elixir, probably the easiest way might be to say current list is equal to map.get. From the DB, we're going to get the current grade value, and we're going to put that into the current list. So let's take a look at what happens if we call this function without anything. Let's see what we get out from the current list. I'm just going to put an ia.inspect in here so we can see what it is. I'll jump back over the test, take this line of code from the top of the file, jump into IEX and load the code. Let's go school.add, and we're going to pass in an empty map. Then what we're going to do is pass in the name Amy, and then the grade 2. And we get nil out, and that's because we've passed in an empty map, and then we've called map.get on an empty map to get our grade 2. And really what we want in here is to not return nil, we want to return an empty list because we want to update it, and we want to put Amy inside. So let's add that argument there. The third argument to map.get is the default value. We'll jump back down into IEX, reload the code, and see what our change did. So now instead of getting nil, we get out the empty list. And what we need to do now is we'd like to add Amy to the current list. So to do that, we can use this notation where we have this and we put current list there, and we put the name at the start. The other way to do it would be if we did something like this, if we had the current list, and then we did plus plus, and then we had the name. And we can't just have name without that because this operator adds 2 lists together. Let's put an ia.inspect at the end of both of those and examine the difference between them. Jump down here, reload the code, and we'll call it Amy. And you can see that it's giving us the same result, and the only time that we're going to see any difference is if we call it again. So if I call school.add again on the output, so this is going to pass in, and actually no, that's not what we want. What we want to do is just select one of these, and I'm just going to choose that one to begin with. Okay. What we now want to do, we'll call this updated list. And now we want to put this back into a map because remember what we want to get out is a map of the results. If we jump back over to the test, we can see that this map is what we expect to get out. We've got that in our comments up here. We've got Amy that we want to get out. So if we want to update a map, what we can do is use map.put, and we'll take the key, which is grade, it's not 2. And actually we need to have the DB as the first argument, then the grade, and then the value that we'd like to put in there is the updated list. Okay. And let's reload the code and see what happens when we do that. So now we get the correct thing out, right? And what we can do now is, since we're returning a map and the function accepts a map, is that we can pipe it to itself. So I can pipe this again to school.add, and I can add Percy to grade 2 as well. And we can see that this function is now working as expected. What I'll do now is just show you the difference between this notation for updating a list and this notation. What I'll do is I'll call this updated list, comment this one out, jump back down, reload the code, and we'll do this one. We'll do this line again and see what happens. And you can see that compared to the previous one, this one had Percy at the beginning, and this second method had Percy at the end. And what's happening is that when we use this notation for adding to the list, it's going to put the name at the head of the list, whereas if we use this notation for adding to the list, it's going to put it at the end. So using one or the other will really depend on you. I can see in the tests that they don't care about the sorting initially, because to confirm that we've done it correctly, it's actually going to be sorting the output in the test, so it's independent of your implementation. I tend to use this one just because it's usually a lot more clear that I want to put something at the end of a list rather than the beginning. If I really don't care about the order, then I'll just put it at the start. A lot of people tell me that this one is more performant. I'll probably agree with that. There's probably some underlying compiler optimization that makes that one quicker. But oftentimes what you want is a list where, because lists are position dependent, you want the last item in the list to be the last one you put in. So one way to do that would be we could do something like list.reverse if we use this technique, but I don't think it's worthwhile. I think sometimes you're better off just using this one. For our case, because we don't care about the sorting, I'm just going to use the faster one, or the one that kind of looks the cleanest in a sense, and we're going to use that one. Let's reload the code again, run that, and we can see that we've got the correct answer. So this should actually allow us to pass those first couple of tests, and I'm going to jump in, comment out the pending, and actually we've got the first one already uncommented. Let's run the test from the README, copy that, paste it in, and we've got our first test passing. That's awesome. We'll jump back into the test, we'll comment out the next one, run that test. Awesome, so our first two tests are passing. Let's also see what happens when we add students to different grades. Now we didn't do this in IEX, so I'll just show you what happens based on our code. Let's load this line up again, and what we'll do is school.add, and we'll add Ben to grade 3. Cool, so now we have Percy and Amy in grade 2 and Ben in grade 3. If we add another line to this, school.add, let's add someone else to grade 3. Let's add Greg to grade 3. So now we have Greg and Ben in grade 3, Percy and Amy in grade 2. So this test here, where we add students to different grades, should also pass. Quit out of that, run the tests again. Awesome. So those are passing now. And our school.add, we now have 3 tests testing school.add, and I'm pretty confident that it's working as expected. So what we can do is actually jump in and refactor it. So the way that we're doing it currently, we have 3 lines to accomplish what we can do in a single line using a function called map.update. So what I'm going to do instead of this is I'll comment this out, and we'll start it again, and I'm going to start with DB at the top, and I'm going to pipe it in just because I like the notation of pipe. We're going to call map.update, and I'm going to show you how we can actually do this 3-step process in map.update. So what map.update expects, if we jump into the docs, let's type in map.update. So it's an arity of 4 function. It expects a map, a key, an initial, and a function. So one thing that usually trips people up is this initial. Let's imagine that with our map.get, we just have the empty list here, right? So now that we've passed in our map, we want the key of grade. What do we want the initial to be? Well, the initial presumably is the empty list. So the initial gets returned when it can't find the key that you're looking for in the map. And then what we want is a function that if there is a key found in the map, what we want to update it. So what this is going to pull out is the current list. And what we want to do to the current list is we'd like to put name at the start of the current list. Let's check what happens when we use this function. I'm going to jump back into IEX. I'm going to load the code again. And what we'll do is we'll just start off with Amy in grade 2. And what we get out is actually just the empty list. And this is because our initial is wrong. If I call this function, you'll see that we've actually skipped the first name in both grades. And that's because our initial, instead of this function getting called on that first time, when we pass in the empty list, it's not going to call the function, it's just going to put initial in there. So the first time we call it, it's just going to do 2 and then the empty list. And then the second time we call it, it's just going to add Percy to that list because something already exists at the key. The simple way to fix this is to just put the name inside here, and that's going to give us the behavior that we expect. Let's check it again. Right, so that's working as it was before, and we'll do it with the long list as well, and that's working as it was before. This initial idea catches out a lot of people when they're using map.update. So remember that this function only gets called if the key already exists, and if it doesn't exist, this exactly is going to be put in there. So what we would have expected here is if the current list is empty, we would add the name to the start of it. So all you need to do is basically assume that this is the end product of calling the function on an empty list or whatever is returned by default. Now that we've refactored that, I'm going to quit out. I'm going to run the tests again to ensure that our function's still working as expected. And I can see that all 3 of those tests that we uncommented before are still passing. And I can jump back in here and remove those comments. And actually, I'll remove these comments too, just to get a little bit of cleaning up done before. Run the tests again because we've changed the code. Let's jump back over to the test and look at the next one. Get students in a grade. So getting students in a grade is one that we haven't implemented yet. That's using the grade function. Let's comment that out, run the tests, and we'll see that it fails. So we don't actually have anything returned. That's failing. Let's jump over and implement it. Let's look at the documentation to see what we need to implement. And this says that the grade function needs to return the names of the students in a particular grade. And that's going to accept a map, the database, as the first argument, and an integer for the grade as the second one. And what it should do is return a list of the names inside. Now, this is a pretty simple one. And really all we're doing is given a particular map. So if we have a comment there, if we have a map of 2 and that's going to Amy, all we really want to do is get the 2 key out of there. And this is going to work. I can show you in IEX what that looks like. If I jump into IEX, I'll load the code. I'll do our thing, and this time I'll assign it to DB, and we'll see what DB is equal to. If we want to get the value for grade 2, we can just do DB and then pass 2 in square brackets at the end of it, and we'll get Percy and Amy out. And let's see what happens when we do it for a grade that doesn't exist. Let's do it for grade 4. We get nil. So the default behavior for using the square bracket notation for accessing the inside of a map is the same as if we use map.get. If we use map.get on the DB and we do 2, that's going to be exactly the same. And if we do map.get on the DB and we pass in 4, that's also going to be the same. The big difference with map.get is that it enables us to pass in a default value, and you'll see in the tests later that that's really, really important. So for now, what we'll do is we'll start out with just the square bracket notation, and we'll see why we should use map.get in general once we do some more tests. So let's just do the square bracket notation, and we just want to get the grade. And if we jump back out and run our tests again, that should now pass. Excellent. Let's look at the next test. So the next test, get students in a non-existent grade. Let's comment that out. Run the test again. And we can see here that that assertion has failed. What it's expecting is an empty list, but what it's returned is nil. So if we look back at our code, that's because, as I showed you in IEX, the default behavior for the square bracket notation for an item that doesn't exist in the map is to just return nil. Now, there are some ways to handle this with using the square bracket notation. What we can do here is use this OR function, and what we can do is OR the empty list. What that's going to say is if this returns nil, we're going to return the empty list. This OR function will basically say, if this is not nil or false, right, return that. If it is nil or false, return the thing on the right-hand side. Let's run the test again, and that should now pass. So that's working, but I don't really like this notation. The much better way would be to use map.get. So with map.get, all we need to do is pass in the DB, and actually instead of doing that, I'm going to pipe it in, just because it allows us to add more stuff later if we want. I'm going to pipe it in, get the grade, and then the third argument there to map.get is going to be the value that we return if the key doesn't exist. So instead of doing this ugly thing up here, we can just pass in an extra argument to map.get, and we get an extra little bit of safety. Let's run the test again and see that it's still passing. Awesome, so that's still passing, and I think we've cleaned up our code a little bit by using map.get instead of the square bracket notation. When in doubt, I always recommend using map.get. It just gives you a little bit more control over your code and makes it a little bit more readable because, I don't know, map.get tells me that I'm getting something out of a map. It tells me that the argument that I'm passing in is a map. I don't make any assumptions about it, and I know that I can return exactly what I want if a key doesn't exist. So I recommend using map.get. Let's look at the next test. Okay, and I can see that this test is a little bit more complex, and I've made a few little additions just to make it a little bit more difficult. I've added Greg and Percy in there to make it a little bit more challenging in the sense that if we actually run this, and I'm going to jump into IEX and run this out to see what we get in our map and then what we need to get out. So let's look at the comment. Sort school by grade and by the student name. This is using the school.sort function. And if we jump over to the module, we can see that sorts the school by grade and name. Let's have a look at what the map looks like before we sort it based on this input. I'm going to jump back into IEX, and I actually had a little bit of a mistake earlier where I didn't record myself doing this. So I do have a line here where I've actually added all of these names to the list. Here we go. So I've got DB is equal to school.add Bart, Jennifer, Christopher, Kareem, and then I've added Percy and Greg at the end. So that's totally fine. It doesn't really matter which order we get it in because the map is going to be sorted. So we can see that the map that we get after calling school.add that many times on all those items is that we have grade 1 with Percy and Greg inside, and you can see that Percy is before Greg, but it shouldn't be because what we're doing is sorting by grade and then by name. By default, because the map is always going to sort the keys, right? So we don't really need to sort by the grade because it's already sorted in the map, but the names inside we'd like to sort. The other thing that I can see here is that instead of returning a map, what we've returned is a list of tuples with the grade as the first element in the tuple and then the list of the names sorted as the second element in the tuple. Let's start building out this function bit by bit. So now that we have our DB, let's go DB and then we'll pass it into school.sort. And we keep in mind that we haven't implemented this function yet. So now we're just returning nil, and that's because there's nothing in there. That just always returns nil. Let's put in the DB. Let's reload the code, call school.sort again. And we've got our first step. What we need to do is convert that into a list of tuples. And actually, the underlying representation of a map can be very easily converted into that. If we just use the function map.toList, we're actually going to get out something that's pretty close to what we want. I'll jump down into IEX, reload the code, call school.sort again, and you can see that we're pretty close. We're actually already sorted by the grade, 1, 3, 4, and 6. But you can see the two differences there are that grade 1 has Greg first in the test. This is what we want. And grade 4 has Christopher, Jennifer, then Bart, rather than Bart, Christopher, then Jennifer. Sorry, yes, the one that we've got there is not correctly sorted, and the one in the test file is correctly sorted. So now what we need to do is we need to go through, and in each one, we need to return the list sorted. So since we're taking in a list of a particular length and we're returning out a list of exactly the same length with the elements modified, what we want to use is enum.map. Enum.map is the functional map syntax. So we're passing in a numeral, and then we're going to add a function that takes the item, each item, so this will be item, and then we modify it in some way and return it back out. So let me just put that down there. So what is the item actually going to be? In our case, it's going to be a tuple with the integer at the start and then the list of students as the second. And let's just return the list of students in there to see what happens when we run this function. I'll reload the code and run school.sort. So we can see that we've actually messed up the structure somehow because now the keys are gone. The keys in the tuple are gone, and that's because enum.map has just returned the list of students. So it's actually just replaced each item in the list with that. And what we want to do instead of calling this integer, let's call it what it actually is, which is a grade. We want to return that same tuple. And so this isn't doing any processing. Let's reload the code, run it again. It's the same thing, but now we can actually modify what's inside. So let's just replace this with an empty list, for instance, and see what that does. Cool, so now we have the empty list in there with the grades at the front. And what we want is the sorted list of students. There's a function called enum.sort that's going to do exactly what we want. So to enum.sort, we're just going to pass the list of students. And this should be exactly what we want. Let's reload the code and take a look what that gives us. So now we have our grades ordered by increasing value, which is exactly what we expect. We haven't done anything special to do that. It's just the way that maps work. And now we have a sorted list of names. So we have Greg, G is before P, so Greg becomes the first name in that list. And then down here we have Bart, Christopher, and Jennifer. And if we look at our test, that's exactly what we expect in the test. So we should be able to quit out of here and have everything work as expected. Let's run the test. And we can see that we've still got that test excluded. So let me comment that out so it's not excluded anymore. And now we have all our tests passing. If we take a look at our implementation, nice. Let's go through, and now that all our tests are passing, we can clean up the code and look for any refactoring opportunities. I'm going to remove this comment just because it's pretty useless up here. Check for comments up here. Okay, so we have no more comments in there other than the module documentation and the documentation for the functions, which I suggest you leave in. That makes it a little bit more clear about the intention. Let's look for opportunities to refactor, and I don't think there are any. The one thing that we could do here is instead of using this DB and then the pipe syntax, we could just replace this with map.update DB and like that. And so that removes a line, but I don't generally like doing this just in case that, let's say we ever want to do anything at the end of this or we ever want to change it somehow before we apply something. If we use the pipe syntax, we can just add another line and add some extra operation in there. Or at the end, we can add another item at the end and do some operation at the end. It just makes it easier to modify, and I don't think it makes it any less readable using the pipe syntax. As you can see, we've done the same thing here with the map.get, and we've also done the same thing here, and this demonstrates why it's a good idea to generally use the pipe syntax if you're changing something in the course of your function multiple times. So here we're applying the map.list function and then the enum.map function. And we've used the pipe syntax just to make that a whole lot more clear and readable. So now that we're all done, we can submit it. Let me just run the test again to make sure everything's still passing after we've changed the code, and that is awesome. Let's use Exercism submit to submit the problem, and that is school.exs. We'll jump back over into Chrome, take a look at the solution, and I will publish this when I finish making the video in the comments. And now we have our published solution. That's great. So grade school's done. That's really awesome. We've finished another Exercism Elixir programming challenge. Thank you very much for tuning in. I hope it was valuable. I hope you learned some things about Elixir, using maps and things like that. If you liked the video, please like it on Facebook or YouTube, and please like our page on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you tune in next time. Thanks.